President of ICRL, and I am very happy to welcome you to this meetup, and I thank you all for being willing to give up hours of this beautiful day to spend with us, especially after all the rain, and you know, it's dry out there, and you're here. Thank you. Today we have a special guest who has been a friend and colleague for many years, Dr. Wayne Jonas. Wayne is a practicing family physician, an expert in integrative and health and healthcare delivery, and he's also a widely published scientific investigator. His book, How Healing Works, was published in 2008, and we have copies of it available on our book table for sale for anyone who would like it. I highly recommend it. It's a great book and very stimulating and thought-provoking. I really enjoyed it personally. Between 2002 and 2006, Wayne was Chief Executive Officer of the Samuel Institute, a nonprofit medical research organization that supported the scientific investigation of healing processes in areas of stress, pain, and resilience. He was director of the Office of Alternative Medicine at the NIH from 1995 to 1999. And prior to that, he served as Director of Medical Research Fellowship at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. He is also a Fellow of the American Academy of Family Physicians. I can go on and on because Wayne has a CV and a list of credits that would take up our whole afternoon to go through. But we are delighted to have him here. He has come up here from Washington, Maryland? Washington, to be with us today, and join me in welcoming Wayne Jonas.
So I don't know if can you hear me without this?
Yes.
Is that okay? And it's not being recorded, right? So you don't need this?
It is being recorded.
It is being recorded.
So that's
Oh, that's okay. All right. It's okay, I'll turn this off.
figure it out now.
Figure it out. I'll just stick it in there. If it's on, then that's fine. Got it. Great. Well, thank you, Brenda. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate coming here and seeing what you're doing in this laboratory. Every time I come back to Princeton area, especially around the group that's interested in consciousness and the tremendous work that's gone on here for many, many, many decades in these areas, and I do come back here periodically. This is probably my fourth or fifth time here over the last couple of decades. I never know whether it's it is the head or the heart of consciousness research. I never can quite figure that out. Does anybody, do you have a, it seems to be both. It alternates back and forth like a real human being. And I really appreciate it. I have a lot of connections here that I don't think you even know, and I'll show you some of those in a minute in those areas. What I'd like to do in my talk, and then as I understand, I've got about 45 minutes to an hour or so to kind of make a few remarks, and then we'll have about an hour or so to have a conversation, which should be great. I'm actually not going to talk about what's in my book, but I'm going to show you how consciousness could connect to mainstream healthcare and why it needs to connect to that area. In the book, and then in other talks that I give, and I'll show you a little bit about what those talks are about, and give that, about how the mainstream healthcare and science is beginning to get it. And what I mean by it, as I'll show you, is get that we are whole people, mind, body, and spirit. And that if we ignore any of those parts, then we can aggravate our own health, if we pay attention to all of those parts and look at reconnecting them, making them whole, then that is actually how healing arises. And that has been quantified. You can say how much healing arises out of that process of holding, becoming whole. It's about 80%. And the stuff we get from what you go to the doctor is about another 20%. We actually know that's been well documented. And so in the core of my book, I say, listen, healthcare, if you want to be part of creating health and well-being, let's get out of the 20% box only and go into the 80% box and really have a complete full-risk care system. That's the next talk I'm not going to say today. Because what I would like to do is I'd like to connect what you all have done here in consciousness research to healthcare and to healing, to the process of healing, and just show you a little bit about what my journey has been on that and where I'm trying to take it in these areas. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll just mention right now the platform that I work out of. Brenda mentioned several jobs that I've had before. I've always had an opportunity to look at global healing traditions through a scientific lens, through a sort of Western scientific lens. I'm a trained conventional family practice doctor. I still see patients within a mainstream family practice. Training residency community, and I'm on a couple medical schools where I teach current students in medical schools who are going to be doctors in the future. And so that's sort of my grounding, but I've always had the opportunity to look outside the box through that lens and learn about that. Now, here's the connection in my life to the concept of consciousness and spirituality, and also to Princeton, into the Princeton area. So this is a picture of my father in 1953 in the Korean War. He's the one standing there with the helmet on, and he has a little cross on his helmet because he was a chaplain in the military for 30 years, and he went through 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, as a chaplain. And this picture was taken just after he had graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary, and then was called into the Korean War, sent over to Korea. I wasn't born yet. And here he is comforting somebody who clearly is distraught, who has what we would call now traumatic stress, probably on the way to post-traumatic issues, and as a chaplain, he is trying to manage that in some way. So starting from before I was born, I had a connection to health, healing, and the spiritual component that I can't escape. And in fact, if I wanted to escape it, my daughter, who is also a chaplain, minister, she went to Princeton, she went to Yale, reminds me that the Spirit is all around us and that it's impossible to escape. And if you want to be whole, you have to go into it. Now, over the decades, I've had some seminal experiences and anticipating others, which is why this timeline goes into the future. Since time does go both directions, into the past and into the future, it doesn't really matter where you draw the now line, except you happen to be where you open your eyes in the morning. But I had a lot of experiences during that time that reinforced the idea that what traditionally is called spirituality by most cultures, including ours, is really the equivalent, has an equivalent component in the human experiences to what is sometimes called consciousness, a much more technical term in these areas. And I'll show you that connection in a minute. Now, I wanted to know what my dad did as a chaplain. He spent 10 years after the wars as a hospital chaplain. That was a new idea, the idea that you would actually train chaplains to be permanent people that worked in hospitals, but he did that. And so he got up in the morning every day and he went into the hospital, just like a doctor would go to the hospital. And I asked him one time what he did in there, and he said, well, I help people heal. I said, well, that's what the doctors were doing. What are you doing in those areas? And he said, well, I help them heal from the perspective of their soul and their spiritual life. So before I went to medical school, I actually was accepted 2 years early, but didn't have to go in a program that my college had saying, well, go do something else and then go into medical school. So I said, well, I'm not going to do science. I'm going to go in and find out what is this spiritual healing program? What is this? I wanted to really see what it was. So I did a lot of different things during that 2 years, but one of the things I did is I spent around 5 to 6 months as a student chaplain in a hospital, training in what's called CPE, or Clinical Pastoral Education. So this is a formal program. My daughter actually spent a year doing it and was a hospital chaplain for a while. She now works at university. And this is where they train chaplains to be in hospitals, just what my dad did. So I knew I wasn't going to be a chaplain. I was going to be a doctor. I already was planning on doing that, but I wanted to see what it was like. So I was accepted to Union Theological Seminary to do a short CPE training program, Clinical Pastoral Education program, to see what it was like to be a hospital chaplain. So here I am, all about 23, and I'm on this team that's teaching hospital chaplains what to do, and I get assigned to a patient who's in the hospital, and I'm supposed to go minister to him. So this is a man who was in the hospital on an IV morphine pump because he had metastatic lung cancer and severe bone pain, and he was in to control his pain. He was end stage, okay? But he was in there getting an IV morphine in order to control his pain, and he asked for a chaplain. He agreed to see a student chaplain first, and so go see him on the 5th floor. So I went up on the 5th floor. I walked into his room. I had no idea what it meant to minister to somebody. He was laying in the bed. He looked to be asleep. And I thought, good, this will be easy. I won't have to talk to him. I won't have to figure out what to do. I'll sit next to his bed, and I'll say a few prayers and that kind of thing, because I don't want to wake him up, right? And so I'm sitting there next to the bed, and I'm closing my eyes, and I'm kind of wondering, well, how long should I do this, and all that kind of stuff. And suddenly I feel his hand on my hand. He reached out of the bed and touches my hand. And his eyes are open. He's looking right at me, and he says, son, you're going to be okay.
Usually you would say that again.
Suddenly, I knew how healing happened, right? He was healing me, right? He saw my distress. He saw that I was there. I didn't actually know what I was doing. And he said, he reached out with compassion and love, even out of his pain state, even out of his Lord consciousness state. And I knew then that healing does not go from a healer to a healee. It doesn't work that way. Okay? It emerges out of a relationship. It emerges out of connection, most of which we cannot see. We cannot measure. And we cannot call by any construct, psychological, except some kind of spiritual emergence in those areas. So I finished my chaplaincy there, but I already learned what I needed to learn, okay, about healing. And that was sort of a seminal event for me. And so when I learned about the research looking at what I call now divine characteristics around that were called in the technical area consciousness, which I had talked about as spiritual, that this was the underlying science behind spiritual healing, and I needed to know about that. So I spent a while doing that in some of my careers. Spiritual healing then becomes sort of a framework around the study of consciousness within the healing of the medical context in those areas. And we'll talk about different terms that people use. Some don't like the term spirituality, and we'll talk about the complications that arises. But if you look across cultures, that's the most common thing we're going to talk about. So what is it? It's healing by mental, spiritual, or energy techniques such as prayer, ritual, mental intention, laying on of hands, or the presence of certain persons, which have been part of all known cultures since the dawn of humanity. And there isn't a culture you can go into where there isn't some kind of form of this in those areas. If you go, surveys that have looked at people like my friend in the hospital find that 80% of them would like to engage in a conversation either with a chaplain around something religious or spiritual if they're sick. 80%. Okay? When patients ask, why, doc? Why is this happening to me? The doctors immediately assume, or at least start to explain the molecular biology, all right? The physiology, the biology of it. But just as equally, they could be asking the question of why me? What does this mean for my life? Okay? What does this mean now as to why I got here, where I'm going? That is an existential or spiritual question. So you have to ask them what they mean by the question why. They ask why. Is it a divine plan in some way, or is it a molecular mechanism in those areas? The materialistic and the non-materialistic component. So probably you've seen this one before. I love this slide. There's formulas on the right, there's formulas on the left, and then the person says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2 where it says a miracle occurs. Okay? And this is how we've treated things like consciousness, like spiritual healing, even the placebo effect we've treated as a miracle. Well, we just don't know what it is. And then we say, well, it couldn't exist, okay, because we don't understand it. And so science wants to understand it, and that requires me to be a little bit more explicit in step 2. So how do we become explicit in step 2 when we're talking about divine characteristics? Okay. How can we apply the scientific lens to the divine? Well, first of all, we have to describe it and define it. And so I'll give you some terms that are used commonly in spiritual practices and religious communities, etc., for the characteristics of the divine. So one could come up with other lists, but these are the most common. The idea of eternity or timelessness, the idea of omnipresence, everywhere, there is no here or there, there's a sense of unity. Omniscience, total awareness, there's awareness and knowledge about everything, everywhere. Unity, it's indivisible. Ordered, it's not chaos, there's very low entropy, to use a physical term. Creative, something actually arises out of what appears to be nothing. You see all the parts, and then something else comes up out of that, creates something else. It is a mystery. No matter how much you look and measure, there's always something that you can't look and measure. So there's always a mystery. And if you think there's not, you think you're seeing the whole picture, then you're actually not seeing the whole picture, according to the spiritual traditions. And in most spiritual traditions, there's this sense of ultimate beneficence. Doesn't mean there aren't judgment gods and destructor and that type of thing, but that the entire divine direction is one for good. Okay? And that good generally means, in our personal experience, a phenomenon that we could describe as love and joy or something in those areas. So if these are the divine characteristics, then how could we go about applying a scientific lens to them? And the approach that I've taken, that we've taken, is a standard approach that you would do to look at any kind of phenomenon using a scientific lens. First, you have to define and describe it. What does it mean? Okay, can you actually say what it is? Measure it in some way. Then you want to study it, which means you want to look at it in different ways. You want to manipulate parts that you can and this type of thing. Measure it in some way. And then, in the area of healthcare, or at least in the area of application, is what do I do with it? Okay, can I use that knowledge in some way if I reapply it back in the real world in those areas? So this is the strategy that I've taken over the last several decades. And here's the more details of the approach. And I don't have to go into all the details. I just want to show you the activities for doing these three different things. Phase 1, we started with descriptions and definitions, trying to come up with a description of what do we mean by the spirit, by the divine characteristics, in a way that we can look at it, and that involved a bunch of things that I'll show you briefly in a minute: meetings, standard discussions among scientists, analysis, that type of thing. Phase 2 was to look at the research on spiritual healing, again, through a critical scientific lens, and say, what does it show us? What do we know? What seems to be real, what seems not to be real in those areas, and can we understand it and begin to come up with hypotheses that can be tested and looked at in those areas. So a research program. And then finally, the application phase, which is what the book's about, but we'll talk to you a lot about today. We'll get up to that and I'll give you a little clue. Can we build a model that incorporates this knowledge when we apply it so that it's a standard part of the way you use it in the case of healthcare healing in those areas. So let's look at phase one, first of all. Okay, so phase one, descriptions and definitions. This has involved a bunch of meetings, 4 major meetings in which we brought healers and scientists together to begin to discuss among themselves and what do we mean by the divine characteristics. Okay, what do you mean by it? What do you mean by it? How do you apply your model? We looked at dozens of different healing traditions, and I'll show you a list in a minute because we wanted diversity drawn from around the world. We looked at their models, what did they say, how it worked in those areas, and looked at ways those contrasted and compared, and then tried to move them using a Delphi process towards identifying what the core characteristics are across those models. What are the fundamental things that are shared by all those models in those areas? We were interested in healing by presence, not by activity. We wanted to know what happens when nothing happens, right? When you're not doing something, giving a pill, sticking a needle in. That's what standard medicine does, right? They come, you get your pills and procedures. But spiritual healer says, no, that's not what produces it. It comes out of our own being, just like, or out of our relationship, just like we did with my friend in the hospital in those areas. So we selected those types of healers, not others that were herbalists and stuff like that. Okay. Definitions. This is a definition that Van Benor came up with. It seems to suffice. It was perfectly good for most people. Spiritual healing is the intentional influence of one or more persons upon another living system without utilizing their own physical beings or intervention. The big debate was whether the term influence was the right one or not. Okay, and I'll show you why. Energy healing, which is sometimes used sort of in place of spiritual healing for some cultures, Chinese culture, for example, is the direction and use of bioenergy, which is often directed by intention, and sometimes can be distinguished by intention, at least their concept of bioenergy, for the improved to influence systems for recovery and repair. So these were basic operational definitions that we came up with. Then we drew together healers from multiple traditions, and here's a list of the major ones that we brought together to do this description and definition. And as you can see, it's really all over the world. We drew Ayurvedic, Chinese medicine, Greek Orthodox, Kabbalistic, Sufi, Native American, brought in Christian evangelical healers, okay, into this area, psychic surgeons, shaman, psychotherapy. There are versions of psychotherapy which are healing by being. Rogerian psychotherapy is actually not a lot of direction. It's presence, for example. Christian Science, and then there's eclectic spiritual healing, a lot of which we pulled out of England. A bunch of spiritual leaders there. They're not affiliated with a particular religion, but they do spiritual healing in those areas. So these are the groups that we brought together, and we brought them together with scientists, epidemiologists, molecular biologists, clinical trialists, etc., to help facilitate and be part of the discussion because we wanted to get to the point where we could say, okay, now we can actually do some research on this. Here are the common explanations or models that came out of these different traditions. And I list 4 of them. These were the main ones. Most of them use some variation of this. One, alignment with God, with the divine, through prayer. And prayer was just getting lined up with God, and then healing emerges out of that. Okay? 2 is an emergence or immersion into something called universal consciousness, this idea of unity. It wasn't the concept of a God out there that I need to align with. It's just getting in touch with a unity that already exists of the universe. Ayurveda, for example, that's their fundamental formative principle in their entire system. Many of them involve transmission of spiritual energy. Okay, I collect the energy and I send it over to you. Qigong is an example of that. Okay, others do this similar type of thing. So we're exchanging energy in some way. And then a number of them, we're dealing with spirits. Extracting the spirits, going out and getting rid of the evil ones, bringing in allies, etc. Was kind of manipulating the unseen spiritual world in those areas. These were the basic fundamental models. There were some other variations, slightly different than that, but these were the fundamental models that were around. Now, when we asked this group using several Delphi processes, and for those that don't know what Delphi process is to generate a list of concepts. In this case, we wanted terms that explain spiritual healing. And then we feed it back to the group, and then they put in and rank them anonymously. And then you tabulate those, you then feed it back to the group, and then you let people talk about, which ones did they think is best, et cetera, and then you feed it back to them again, and then re-rank them, etc. We did that several times using that sort of modified Delphi process with the terms that they generated. And these were the terms that came up that were considered the essential components of spiritual healing. And I put two of them up on the top because almost every group agreed that these two were essential. Okay? Now, actually, it wasn't everyone. There was one group that didn't agree with all of them in that particular one. And afterwards, we can discuss which one that was. And I'm not sure. Actually, I think it was probably a terminology issue. We actually got into it. They said, "That's okay. You just didn't use that word." Okay, serious. The two top ones were love and intention. Love is something that captures or generates the power of healing. Okay, it is directed. It's considered the only component by almost all these groups that was necessary, though not sufficient, to produce healing. Okay, it's defined as an experience of deep connectivity with others or other, and it was considered divine in nature. Okay, it had the divine characteristics that we were talking about. Intention is what directs that power. So the intention was added in the benevolent part of the intention, and it was cultivated through mind-body types of practices and various types of practices. These were the two components that were aspects of almost all these traditions in those areas. And so intention and love of some type became the focus of the research. There was a lot of challenges when we then started to talk to the scientists about, all right, can you do something with this? Can we begin to investigate it? That couldn't really be resolved, but are challenges if we really want to move this area forward. For example, there's a big overuse of the meaning love. It means a lot of different things, from erotic love to divine love, etc., in our culture. And so using the term love had some interpretive issues. Same thing with healing. Wound healing, is that what we're talking about? Is it just that, etc.? In those areas. A lot of confusion over the terms. These are not resolved, but spiritual, what do you mean by spiritual? What do you mean by energy? What do you mean by consciousness, etc.? People use them in all kinds of different ways. Subjective measurements, since this was so subjective, often made it very difficult to actually apply scientific components to this. You've got to measure something, but it's subjective and it varies quite a bit. Unclear goals. What are you actually trying to get out of the research? What's the goal for the research in those areas? And as you'll see in a minute, that was a major growth. Very often this is psychologicalized. The term psyche in the West actually means soul. Okay? And so our version of what used to be spiritual healing is now psychology, right? And it's becoming scientific, right? And so that's acceptable, except we still don't use it as often as we need to. In those areas. Biologized, I don't think that's a word, but anyway, the idea that it only works when you can see the brain. And so, wow, you see the MRI change in some way, and boy, that must be real, right? Not with the other stuff, and the other stuff wasn't. So they said this is a problem, because we're not talking about that. It's not religious. Often spirituality in the term is associated with being religious. It's transpersonal and And here, for mainstream Western science, is probably the most problematic. It's not causal. It means A does not bump up against B to produce C. It does not work that way. Just like my friend in the hospital, it emerged out of some type of relationship and it didn't go for me to him. Okay? But it happened. And this is problematic because it's also not causal in terms. It's not only not causal in terms of space. Means it doesn't matter if I'm in this room or if I'm across the world, it's also not causal in terms of time, which really confuses people. But that was fundamental acceptance, and it is a characteristic of the molecular design, right? Just described, it's considered a characteristic. Anyway, so these were some of the challenges that we had. Now, what was interesting is that we drew a figure that almost every everybody said, this is a good way to communicate this, okay? They really liked the way of communicating this. This is a figure of what does a whole person actually look like. It's a schematic of what a whole person looked like. And this particular version has 3 dimensions. So you see mind, body, you see body, mind, and spirit, okay? Body is on the outside, mind or the psyche is a little bit deeper, and spirit is in here. We think that those correlate with things like matter, energy, and information in terms of how they're assessed, how they're looked at in those areas. But the interesting thing about that, if you say look at these 3 different persons, here's person 1 and here's person 2. Now if you're just looking at the body, they're right next to each other, right? So, you know, you can look at them. But if you're looking at person 3, you assume they're somewhere else. But if you look at them as a whole person, mind, body, spirit, then on the spiritual level, they're actually the same. They are, in fact, connected, directly connected. So if you pay attention and acknowledge that a whole person is mind, body, and spirit, then a whole person actually is directly connected to every other person in the universe, all the time, on this particular level, not on this level, okay? You know, but if this is real, then there can be transmissions of information through that. And so the fundamental nature of seeing people, which we seem to have lost a lot in the West with a more materialistic approach, is that we start to think, okay, this is what a person is. This is some epiphenomena that we get to measure in psychology, right? And, you know, spirit, yeah, that's for somebody else to deal with. It's not real. We actually don't believe it's real in those areas. And this is the fundamental problem within healthcare today. And what it means to be a whole person doesn't mean to take care of everything about the person. It means simply to see them as a whole person, to see them in fact, and look for the mind, body, and the spirit in those areas. So that's the concept that sort of came out of all of this. And the scientists then said, I can begin to look at this in some way. All right, so phase 2. Let's look at the research. What do we know about spiritual healing? Again, given all the caveats I've said about the characteristics and the way science, reductionistic science, especially causal science, especially goes about this, if we apply that lens, okay, what do we know? Okay, so here's what we did, collected all the studies we could find on spiritual healing or those phenomena over decades, applied critical systematic reviews, had again 4 different conferences, large conferences on this, and then developed a research program that went over a couple of decades. Wasn't as prolific as the one here at Pair, but it did produce a few papers and a couple of books and that type of thing. But again, we are focused on the idea of spiritual healing in these areas. So here's the review of the evidence, okay? Again, I'm not going to show it all to you. You can read about it in a different book. I'll point out to you in a minute. But to critically review the science, apply quality research standards, and I'll show you what those are. Those are well accepted within the mainstream, okay? And determine evidence levels, which is what you do in healthcare. You say, how good is the evidence? Okay, 1, 2, 3, ABCs. There's ways of doing that that are considered standard approaches. Here's the way you determine evidence levels in mainstream medical science. It's called the hierarchy of evidence, and at the bottom are things that are less good at getting at causal attribution, and at the top are the things that are better at getting causal attribution, okay? So qualitative components, descriptive components can't tell you a whole lot about what's causing what. Non-randomized studies, randomized trials are felt to be better at getting at attribution, but then if you really summarize them and do what we call meta-analyses of those, and that's really what gets proof of attribution of causal component. And what do you notice immediately from what was said before about using this kind of a hierarchy? This is the standard hierarchy, okay? One of the characteristics of the mind is it's not causal, all right? So we are already or automatically trying to force it into a rating system that says the causal are better than the non-causal, but we've already said the nature of this phenomenon that we're trying to examine is not causal. So there's a problem with that, but that's what we did because we wanted the mainstream folks to be part of it. We wanted to look through that lens, but pay attention to what happened. Okay. Here's the quality review criteria. This is standard, again. This is what Cochrane collaboration, National Academy of Sciences, etc. go in for determining whether something is real or not, okay? control groups, randomization, baseline comparability, drop-down. Now, this is how you evaluate research. The quality of research is how you design research, effective blinding, appropriate outcomes measures, statistical analysis, independent replication, right? I mean, Baer did that for years, right? Tried to apply all of these standard causal approaches to consciousness and look at those areas, especially the replication, which we're now discovering in mainstream science isn't very good. Only about a third of things published in the New England Journal of Medicine can actually be replicated, or in science can actually. That's mainstream. That's when you've got something hard to measure, right? A molecule or something in those areas. But that was what was thrown in these areas, okay? Non-replicability and all that kind of stuff. But this is what we looked at, okay? So looking at that lens, and I'll show you a book in a minute that came out that rated all these studies in those areas. Here are the categories that we looked at: religious and spiritual practices, intercessory prayer, laying on of hands, energetic processes, qigong, which is sort of a major Chinese approach to energy transmission, mental interaction with living systems, so this is your intentional influence on biology and cells, etc. Mental interaction with non-living systems, mind-matter interactions. A lot of the random event generator stuff is looking at that type of stuff. And then we wanted to know, well, what does it actually look like in the clinical application? What happens in practice in those areas? What kind of effects do we see so we can compare it with these other control groups? So those are the areas we looked at. I won't go through all the research. You can read the book. Here's a summary. Mind-matter interactions work. Even applying all those other caveats that we talked to, looking through the reductionistic lens, what's been proven, much of which was generated out of Baer and then just went all over the world, and lots of replication of it, shown that our intention influences physical phenomena. Randomization, entropy, the way the car's going down the street, the number of people that say hi, the balls that fall, et cetera, okay? All those things. That absolutely works, okay? And its effect size is small when you put it into this kind of micro lens of causality. You don't see big effects, but man, are they statistically significant. They are definitely there, okay? They work, okay? Mental interactions in living systems, harder to do. It's harder to work with living systems. The variability in them is much greater, so it's a little harder to prove as well as you can with mind-matter interactions, but pretty much going in the same direction, showing the same thing. The rigorous studies were showing that most of them can be done. Again, small effects, but statistically significant. Prayer and layering on of hands, just not enough work. Just not enough work. Again, we're messy, right? Now we're in clinical studies. We got a variation of different people. They practice differently. They do things differently. They may or may not have been applicating these divine characteristics, especially the key ones that we've talked about in those areas. The Qigong studies, most of those are in Chinese. We had, fortunately, some Chinese scientists that looked at it all and applied all the same criteria. The quality, based on the criteria that I showed, was so poor that we just couldn't say. But anyway, lots of claims, okay, huge claims, curing this, curing that, etc. But when you look at the actual research, it just didn't apply appropriate methodologies. Religion, can't really randomize to religion, right? Can't really say, okay, you be a Catholic, you be a Methodist, you be an atheist, okay? And then come back in 20 years and we'll see how it pans out, right? Can't quite do that. Can't do that with smoking, by the way, either. But clearly there are positive correlations between engagement in religious practices and health. Lots of data showing that using association data, okay? Using observational studies, and then trying to control those as best as possible. The clinical impact, clearly, of the application of this area, I can give you some examples, is significant. There's major impacts if you look in a clinic. I'll give you one example. One of our researchers was a British, very prominent British physician in the National Health Service, was very curious about these areas. He ran a large practice in the middle of England, and he brought a spiritual healer into the practice, put her over into a room, and then he took some of the most complex, highly expensive, high-utilizing patients that he had in his practice. These are the people that came back lots, used lots of money. He tracked all their data, their clinical indications, their costs, for a year or so before that. Then he offered them option of going in and visiting the spiritual healer in the corner. Okay? And so most of them said, hey, he's saying this is an option, it's covered by my health insurance, et cetera, sure. So the vast majority of them said fine. So they started going to her, and they had like 12 visits or something they were offered, et cetera. And then he started tracking these folks, and they had precipitous reductions in healthcare needs, improvements in healthcare costs, et cetera. I mean, major changes in this group that was very, very sick. And so the physicians in the practice started to say, well, what the heck's going on? Okay, and he showed them the data, said, what's going on over there? And so she finally then gave a talk to the practice, and she said, what do you do? Well, I bring them in the room, I talk to them, I listen to them. Okay, what's going on in your life? Okay, you know, what are you struggling with? What are your hopes? What are your aspirations, etc.? And then they lay down, and I have them breathe and relax, and I kind of lay my hands over them, and I do my little spiritual, thing, and then I say to them, if you need to come back, come back. Okay, that's it. And the physicians were saying, oh, wait a minute, we could do that. We could listen to people, and we could, breathe with them, and and ask them what's important in their life and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, sure, you could, couldn't you? But you don't. And that's what she did. Okay, huge impact on her healthcare outcomes. So clearly, she was combining lots of things in that process that these other reductionistic studies were trying to disentangle with a small part. She was delivering, attending to them as spiritual beings, okay, the whole person, allowing that to be seen and experienced by them, the integration, okay, and out of that, things happen. So, could be there. Of course, criticism of that by scientists is that, well, it's placebo, right? Of course it is, yes, that's a placebo effect. It's delivering expectation, it's sitting down and doing a ritual, all the things that go into placebo effects. So, okay, it's placebo, but that's not real, right? Placebo's not real. We want to do real stuff. We want to know that the molecule's producing effect, not all the other stuff. We're not going to, that's how FDA approves those molecules. Okay, you've got to show that it's different than the placebo. All right. What is the problem with this approach? And I already talked to you about, we sort of could have anticipated some of this, because it's not causal, subjective outcomes, et cetera, in these areas, and we're really not sure what the mystery is that we're dealing with. There's clearly a mystery out of which healing emerges. We actually don't know what it is, and according to the idea of divine theory, it's always there. You can never get rid of it, okay? Which means you can't have to acknowledge it, but you can't control for it, okay? So what does this look like? So I'm going to show you just one slice of this literature just to sort of illustrate this. And I want you to kind of put your God hat on for a minute, okay? So if I was God, and here I've got all these divine characteristics, and this is the way the world works, and you come to me and you say, I want to prove that you're having an influence, okay, on some clinical outcome using standard randomized controlled studies, okay, high quality randomized controlled studies, okay? I'm going to use that tool with all of its, limitations, and then you tell me whether you're there or not, whether you're working or not. Okay? Just imagine that for a minute. So the way you do that in standard medicine is that you say, well, let's get some relatively uniform studies of the same condition and see if we can get the interventions to be relatively uniform, okay, as close as possible, and the interventions and the outcomes, etc. Well, here's 5 studies, all published on prayer for cardiovascular disease. So we're sort of getting there, right? We got a little cohort of that. The BIRD study, Southern Medical Journal, large randomized controlled trial of cardiovascular disease with people assigned to prayer or no prayer. So supplemental prayer or just whatever they got. Paris, another one, very large study, even bigger, okay, in those areas. Both of these, I'll show you the results of these in a minute, but I put them in order because one built on the other, okay, at least conceptually. Mayo Clinic then did a study of prayer, Ms. Krukov, Duke did a study of prayer, and Herbert Benson did a large study of prayer, all published in mainstream journals, Okay, so quality was there, peer-reviewed, etc. And here's what they showed. Okay, Bird, first one done really of this genre. It's impossible to be sure that, first of all, it was positive. It was statistically positive in favor of prayer. And it took him a while to get it published. 1988, okay? It takes a while for all these to be published. Impossible to be sure that controls were not praying or being prayed for. Therefore, peer groups were not attained. However, there seems to be a beneficial effect to supplementary prayer. That was radical back in 1988. And this is a mainstream body. So positive, okay, God works. All right? Paris, huge study, methodologically by far the best. Okay? High quality, large groups, randomized to prayer, not prayer. Major difference between the two groups. Remote intercessory prayer was showed at the lower coronary care unit, these were heart patients, suggesting that prayer may be an effective adjunct in standard medical care, published in the Archives of Internal Medicine. There's a problem with this study. He did not put people through informed consent, which means he didn't ask them if they could be entered into a study where they might be prayed for with extra. Okay? Somehow that got through the IRB, and he did the study. It allowed him to get huge numbers because now he didn't have to bring in every single person and ask them to enter a study. That takes a huge component. So from a perspective of rigor, it's great because he doesn't have the placebo effect, right? And he doesn't have the impact of informed consent, which we know influences people one way or another. So it's much better, and he could get large numbers. Okay, so it actually do a red-like thing. Those are highly positive. God works. Okay? So now we have 3 following studies, all of which were negative, and the last of which were very negative. Okay? Mayo Clinic, intercessory prayer for cardiovascular disease, no benefit between added prayer and non-added prayer. Then followed up with that, Kukov, very meticulously designed by a believer in this area. For those of you who know about the goat and sheep components. Negative, no difference between the two groups. And then Herb Benson did a very large study, it took a long time, met all the criteria, prayer, no prayer, or standard recovery from cabbage. Not only was there no effects, but those who had been told they were going to get, could get intercessory prayer, had higher complication rates. So it looked like it was actually amazing. All right? So, okay, put your God hat back on. That was your science hat. Put your God hat back on and say, okay, did I get the message across? Okay. Let's see. They're going to ask me using this one particular lens, like a microscope. I'm over here, and they're looking down here, okay? And they want to know, am I doing anything? Okay? How do I answer that question? I don't care for what time period is over. Okay, I don't go by one particular study, but if I take the whole bundle of stuff, how do I answer the question? Well, I don't want to say no, because I'm glad they're doing it. I'm here. I'm actually participating in the world. Maybe I created it, etc. But on the other hand, I don't want to tell them that if they ask for it in this way, I'm going to give them exactly what they asked for, because maybe I'm here to show them something else, or maybe they need to do something else. How am I going to do that? I'm going to do exactly this, okay? I'm going to give you great positive stuff, and then I'm going to say, you know what? You haven't figured it all out. All right? Keep looking, keep thinking. Maybe you need some different methods in those areas. Just my speculation. I'm not drawing. I can't tell you what it is. But here's the right methods for the right question. I believe I have a new approach to psychotherapy, but like everything else, it has first to be tested on mice. Completely wrong method. I mean, that's not how you test psychotherapy, right? In those areas. So we need to really understand what we're doing. And in a limited time, I'm going to just kind of go right to this particular thing. So clearly, this concept of expectation, belief, placebo, etc., is a major component. And here's a study done by Harold Balak in which he randomized people to get spiritual healing or no spiritual healing, and then he gave them knowledge and expectation that they were getting it, or no knowledge. So this is the informed consent part that Harris removed. And what he showed is that knowledge and expectation markedly enhance the effect. Okay, the healing had an effect. This is before, this is after, this is pain scores. I put this on fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue, or this is fatigue scores. But when they knew they were engaged in the prayer, when their mind was part of it, this markedly increased effect in those areas. So there's a synergistic component of that. So we call this placebo response, but Dan Warman and I have said years ago, that's the wrong word. We should call it the meaning context effect, okay? Because it is really about how do you generate meaning. And that's an entirely different topic. Most of the medical profession believes that most of the treatment ought to be coming from here. That's the treatment. And this is what the placebo effect is. Most of them acknowledge it's about 30 to 40%. That's what they think. It's a completely wrong aspect. The meaning response in most studies is actually the majority of the effect, and the treatment effect is small in those areas. And that's been shown in many types of interventions and many types of conditions. Okay, so we published several things on this. This was the book I was referring to. I think you know about this one on the right. We wanted to take all the pair stuff that had biological components, all right, you know, cell, animal models, that type of thing. So let's just get it collected in one place and published a special issue on Explorer as a tribute to some of the work in that area. All right, which way do we go? And I'm cognizant of the time here. So I just wanted to kind of skip through this fairly briefly. We need to know more about how we can measure these areas, as you can see. And here's a bunch of ways to measure, but I want to measure them in the biological area. I want to measure them in healing, okay, not just in the area of, say, a physical event occurring. And so I want to look at collective intention. I want to look at spiritual healers in action. I want to look at this time problem, okay? So here you know all of this. This is a Shoshone healer ritual at the Devil's Tower, and this is around event mark, and you all know how this is, right? You've seen this. And as the ritual goes on, the deviation from randomness just goes further and further and further as they go through. Here's the Reg 9/11 collective consciousness that Roger has been managing and monitoring for a long time. During this collective event generators going on all around the world. This is an aggregate, and this is September 11th. The Twin Towers, etc., and went way off the roof. Roger was shown over and over again with multiple collective conscious events in those areas. So we wanted to know, well, could this be a way of measuring the effect of could you use a Reg device to measure the effect of whether a healer is actually working authentically in the divine space or not? All right? So we brought a bona fide healer, a Polish healer named Mitek Burkes, who works very nicely with labs and research and has for years. He was at a miniature clinic actually for a while. And so we stuck a random event generator in his clinic while he was practicing, and then we took it over to a separate site, and I'll tell you why we didn't stick it in his site when he wasn't there in a minute. We brought him into the laboratory. Different major differences between the operation of the random event generator while he was in the process of healing people compared to a neutral site like a library. Okay? You can easily see the difference. We brought him into the laboratory. They said, well, can he influence cells and cell cultures? So we had a great molecular biologist at Walter Reed who studied floriculture cat cells, and he would put his hands around major cat cells, and then we would measure calcium transmission tagged with fluorescence. The calcium transmission in and out of the cells fluoresces, since you can actually see it, you can quantify it. It's a direct correlate with the generation of ATP, the energy molecule within the body. So actually produces more energy when you see the calcium flux go up. You actually have more ATP produced in the cells. And then we set up this system, and he came in many times over a couple of years. And the basic protocol is 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off, or 15 minutes with various other people who weren't doing whatever he was doing. Okay? in those areas. We had sham groups, we had no treatment groups, et cetera, in those areas. And I see. There's that. This is a fun little video if I can get it to play. So here, for example, this is what it looks like. So here's what it looks like under the microscope, and as you can see, these cells are flashing, and that's when their calcium flux is coming out when the ATP's production. And so you can visually see this going on while he's healing. It goes on spontaneously, there's a baseline, and then when he comes in the room, these little buggers start popping, okay? However, he had to learn how to do this because he uses love and intention when he heals people. And he wasn't quite sure how to do it there. So we actually had to bring him in the laboratory. He had to learn, where do these cells come from? And, you know, what are they like? And how do I learn how to love these cells? Okay? And we got to know them, we got to like them, etc. We tried all kinds of different things. And after that, he was able to just replicate this on a regular basis. And during the discussion, I'll tell you a couple of major anomalies. But then you can quantify this. It's in a fluorescent counter, and you can see it, quantify it. And here's what happens at the top. Okay, it's his bioenergy 15-minute treatment, bumps it up significantly. This is our placebo post-op who comes in and does the same thing, but has no idea what she's doing in those areas. Then we subject them to a heat stress, and they're markedly protected against heat stress afterwards compared to the control groups in those areas. This is 4 hours after he leaves. Okay? So he's been there for a couple hours doing these experiments, generating his love and intention, and then he leaves, and then we bring a set of cells into the room, and they start to bump up in their calcium flux compared to the control area. Okay? And that lasts for about 6 to 8 hours. And we call this the linger effect. He was something was being conditioned within the room to continue to produce the effect. And Bob, others Bob studied this, Roger, you've studied this, where you go into a sacred site where there's constant prayer, constant ritual, etc., and you feel something different. Okay, well, we can measure. I won't go into this. This was just looking at our correlation at the distance, and basically showed that people who were miles and miles away, when they were empathic, when they were paying attention to each other, they were consciously aware of each other, their EEGs began to synchronize in those areas, very easy to measure it. This is a Markov chain, a variation on the random event component. The goal, however, was to determine which way did intention influence random phenomena. Was it forward or backward in time? The initial studies were done by Dean Raven, in which you could actually tell where in the time phrase that the influence was occurring. And long story short, it doesn't go forward in time, but backwards in time. Okay? Your imagination goes to wherever you're going to measure it. Okay? And then it influences it reverse. It's retrocausal. Okay, in these experiments, okay? It's not, which automatically means all those studies that you show on cardiovascular were wrong. They're designed wrong in those areas, okay?
Could you explain that again, like how it's a retroactive?
Yeah, so, we have time to do it? Yeah, so, I probably have to go backwards once. What he does is that he's got multiple nodes where he's measuring either 50-50 distribution of the random event components, or he can alter it so it's 80-20, 20-80, etc., but it ultimately ends up in 50-50 at the end, okay? Just like a regular random event generator. But now he can measure what's happening at all the stages along the line. So, if your intention starts here, and it's influencing these nodes this way, there's a certain pattern of distribution that you're going to see. If it starts in the middle and goes this way, then you'll see a different pattern of distribution. If it starts over here and goes this way, then you'll see a different pattern of distribution. You can predict that, okay? You can actually mock it out, simulate it out, and basically what he showed is that it goes from where you're going to measure it back to your intention, okay? And so I think this was the simulated prediction if it was retrocausal, and this is the actual data, okay? And these are all other variations of forward causality. So if it was forward causal, some way it should look more like that. It doesn't look at all like that. It looks completely like a retrocausal model, okay? I don't know if that helped or not, but your imagination draws you, okay? Your intention doesn't influence you. Of course, that's what all the healers thought, right? Healers all thought that, they didn't all think that. And some of them got this immediately, is that what you're doing is that you're creating a potential future, and that potential future is actually drawing the probability that will then get manifest toward it. Okay? It's centrifuge, exactly. And that's actually been studied in other things, but this is a great model to look at that in those areas. Okay. All right. So phase 3, which I'm not going to get into, but we can talk about during the break. How do you apply this in a conventional, standard way in mainstream healthcare? And this is what kind of talks I've been giving in grand rounds all over the country, all over the world for the last year and a half. I'll give you one taste. Number 1, you just pay attention to the whole person. You just make sure that they're always paying attention to mind, body, spirit, right? And this is the model that we use to do that. Spiritual is in the middle. Social and emotional, that's where the love comes from, right? Behavior and lifestyle, and how does this manifest in what you do, that makes the difference. And then the body and the external, the actual treatment in those areas. And so treating a whole person means asking questions about those. And I have a tool that I apply, that I teach residents, and I teach medical students, and I teach regular physicians to apply in their practice, which starts by asking the person what matters in their life, just like the healer asked, right? And then out of that looks at what are they doing to support that process, and what can I do in my practice to support that process, okay? Starts with the spiritual question. I don't call it a spiritual question. I just say, what gives you joy? Right? What gives you meaning? What do you love? Why do you get up in the morning? Okay? And now can we make sure your health and our healthcare supports that process in those areas? Okay? That automatically gets them to pay attention to the whole person. I don't have to even show them this model, a formal model, you can do it. When you ask them how it relates to their past history or their future, that is the time dimension. Okay? How was your childhood? One of my standard questions. Gets them to go, oops, let's skip over that. How was your childhood? That goes in the past. And it brings that past into the current conversation. Where do you think you'll be in 5 years? The question of where do you think your health will be in 5 years is one of the most powerful predictors of mortality we have. Better than smoking, better than high cholesterol, better than whether you exercise or eat right, etc. That one question, okay, is a huge predictor on how you'll actually do it. It's tapping into the spiritual component. All right, what do you imagine in the future, and where are you being drawn to? Okay. I actually know that. Yes, go ahead.
You said 5 years. Why do you choose 5?
They needed to pick it, and 10 was way too much for most people. Okay, 5 they could say, well, most people still had 5. Or thought they had 5. Okay, so that's sort of kind of doable. You could have done 1. Would have been different on the Markov chain. It would have been shorter on the Markov chain.
I thought it would have taken 7.
Okay, you would have taken 7. So anyway, it's just what they did. It's called, if you want to look it up, it's called Cantrell's ladder. It was formed in 1965. It's been validated as a huge predictive assessment tool in all kinds of populations. And then, of course, there's the mystery, which is, I I need to pay attention to that. The mystery is going to show up sometime. It'll show up anytime. But if I'm not waiting for it, if I think I've captured everything, all the healing possibilities that can occur, like the things I've asked, even the ones I just described, then I'm missing that divine characteristic in those areas. So you can call out whatever, there's lots of nerves, cultural variability, zero-point intelligence, angels, however you want to describe it. So if you want to see how it actually works in practice, you have to come to my next talk. I have a tool that I give physicians to hand to patients. It's called the Personalized Health Index. It starts by saying what matters to you in your life, and then what are you doing to help support that process. And it rapidly launches people on their healing journey. I use that then to have a discussion with them with what I call the Hope Note. These 10 questions, I ask them to do the Hope Note. That's called the Healing-Oriented Practices and Environments Note. Physicians do SOAP notes. That asks you what's the matter, how do I treat it. The Hope Note asks what matters. That's the spiritual question. Don't call it that. It immediately engages them in the core part of who they are as spiritual beings. So the rest of the questions are simply connecting it to, the psyche and the social and spiritual affairs. And then there's a way of embedding this in a medical record, and you can do it in 10, 20 minutes in those areas. Okay. Daniel Borstein said the greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. By far. It isn't that we haven't done the experiment, it's that we thought we think we have done the experiment in those areas. And I'd like to end with this little poem that I wrote that just came to me one time. I thought it must be chemicals congealed in globs and helicals until they said ionic charge controls the greater world at large. But then we found that ions spin, producing vectors from within. Electromagnets were the way to keep the field of life in play. First, quantum probability is observed through window frequencies, then locking spins and solitrons, now resonating cyclotrons. Alas, the scalar wave rules all. Heard of that? That morphogenic pulsing ball untouched by any perturbation, except the child's imagination. By now, I hope you have my bet the world rests in divine intent, and truth so often thrown asunder comes to us when held in wonder. I hope you have. Yes, please.
You heard this talk, Deepak Chopra. He talks about consciousness and meditation and real and that.
Yes.
Do you relate to his thinking and philosophy, or is it what you do?
I know Deepak, and I think Deepak has been plowing the area of the spiritual components of the human being and putting it out there for decades. And he gets great resonance among the public because they get it, right? They know it. For those who are in the scientific professions, they get it in their personal life, but they're not quite sure how to apply it into their professional life. Okay? And it's been challenging for him or others doing similar kinds of things to help them connect to what do I do day to day, right now, in my clinic, or in my hospital, or in my healthcare system, that can actually tap into this reality and make it happen. And so the difference between what I'm trying to do with the Hope Note and all that stuff is give physicians tools without any kind of, I don't care what the language is, without a kind of language. They don't have to use consciousness, they don't have to use spirit, they don't have to use any of those things, but they have to ask what matters. They have to ask the patient what brings them joy. They have to ask them, what do you live for? Why do you actually want to engage in some kind of health behavior or treatment, etc.? And when you do that, you do this. You apply the whole person and you apply the spiritual.
Dr. Chopra also believes in meditation that seems to promote healing.
So meditation is a tool, like many other behavioral tools, that can help you get see more clearly what's deeper inside you. Okay, and so if you get too distracted as to what's going on that outer ring of the human being, then you're not paying attention to the other parts, right? So meditation is simply a way to help you see that deeper part in those areas, and it's very helpful. It's very effective.
Yeah, with respect to what you were just talking about, where people envision, how they expect to be in 5 years, I was wondering if you could speak about the fact that we're all living much longer, and there's no superological reason from the perspective of medicine as to why we're, living longer. I mean, certainly there are advances in healthcare and whatever, but I've been told anyway that there is a factor that science cannot explain, and it occurs to me that maybe this is a factor where people have an expectation of living longer because, we can envision things in the future more than we could in the past. Hundreds of years ago, you were just lucky to make it through the day. And now we go, in 5 years, I want to make sure I've gone to, Europe, or I've done this or that. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, great question. Why are we living longer? And I think there's a couple reasons. The most obvious one is because we're not dying younger. All right? And we're not dying younger because we have a medical system that saves us, physically saves us, okay? We're not dying at 5. If you go over to, Africa, a third of the kids die before they're 5, okay? We have an emergency response system and surgery and interventions that will keep you alive when you have a heart attack or an infection or pneumonia. And one of the problems is that we can apply it even when we shouldn't be kept alive. Okay, or you don't want to be kept alive. That's the problem. That's number one on average. Okay. Number two, when you get older, there's been several studies published. In fact, a very large one just recently that showed one of the biggest drivers for longevity as you get, if you don't die of a physical thing early on or hit by a bus, is purpose. If you have purpose in life, if you're living for something, usually something outside yourself, family, culture, community, etc., those people live longer. And I think the mechanism is this: I can imagine myself doing this. I think it's because purpose gets at this spiritual component. You have to pay attention to identify truly what's purposeful for you and meaningful for you. You have to pay attention to, those characteristics that are important to you, and they're not the physical component. And that highly correlates with longevity. Now, over the last 3 years, the life expectancy in this country has gone down, not up, after 80 years of going up every single year. Why is it? Okay. They blame it on what they call diseases of despair, which lead to opioid use, chronic pain, suicide, those types of things. Those are the reasons, okay? And what are diseases of despair? Loss of purpose. So I think those are, in my mind, two of the explanations. I mean, there's other things. We don't know how to treat certain kinds of infections that used to kill us in those areas. Yes.
I found a lot of interactions with individual doctors to be good, but I wonder why for the patient, interfacing with the medical system has now just beginning to feel like being drowned under a giant wheel, and how doctors are contributing to that in some way. Like, for instance, Columbia Presbyterian, where I have a few doctors, now has changed their entire hospital to one phone number. So you call up, you want to make a routine appointment, you have to go through millions and millions of steps to even get to a department. And then they started doing that even in Princeton. It's kind of crazy that the patient is being forced all the time into these crazy situations that feel Kafkaesque. And you're talking about diseases of despair. Even dealing with the medical system is really creating a lot of despair. I just want to say I was diagnosed at Columbia with MS in 1982. I've never taken any of the medications. I've saved the medical system literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've never even been hospitalized. And I feel why is it, is it really about healing, or is it really about money? And why are doctors, throwing up their hands and sort of letting this happen?
Now, first of all, you're absolutely right that most physicians, almost all physicians, not all, okay, but most physicians are there because they're compassionate, caring, they want to actually be healers. And most patients will say, I love my doctor. Okay, it's just when I sit down with them and talk to them, etc., they're great. They're there to try to help me, da-da-da-da-da. And that is true. The system itself sucks. Okay? The system itself sucks, and it's frustrating everybody. Burnout in doctors is now approaching, or in some cases, exceeding 50%. Okay? Literal measurement of burnout, which means that I don't know how to have compassion anymore.
Right.
Because I'm in a treadmill that says do this, do that, and it doesn't allow me to ask the patient what matters and get to know them. Okay? I can't deal with the spiritual component. I can only deal with the outside component, and I can only do it in 15 minutes. Okay? And this is being recognized more and more. It's driving the cost of healthcare up. It's driving burnout. It's driving dissatisfaction. And the organization of medicine, which was created to stop people from dying of infectious disease and trauma 100 and 150 years ago, is now being applied to everything. Because we used a reductionistic system, which works when you have a specific trauma and you need your bone fixed. It better be reductionistic, okay? Or you have an infection and you can treat it, okay? That's going to save your life. But it doesn't work when you apply it to complex chronic diseases over a lifetime. In fact, it's counterproductive. But that's the system that we have because we developed a science around that and then an economic engine to reward that, okay? And so, well, then the politicians get into it and say, well, you know, how do we manage the costs, right? That's, you know, well, let's shuffle it around. You know, they haven't fundamentally said, what kind of a healthcare system is going to produce health? They've said, how do we just provide everybody what we are doing? And that's a shell game, okay? Is it going to be you? Is it going to be the employer? Is it going to be the government? And it doesn't matter, because unless it changes to take care of the whole person along the lines I just talked about, okay, then the costs are going to continue to go up and the outcomes are going to continue to go down. Because what we're doing in the system is not the right model. It's the right model for the acute care, okay, but it's the wrong model for chronic disease. So we have to shift the incentives, including the payment structure, okay, so that it actually allows for the care of the whole person. Now, there's a term for this in policy circles. Okay? They call it value-based medicine. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to take a volume-based system, which makes tons of money, right? And they're trying to shift it so now I'm going to pay you one fee for taking care of the whole person, and I'll give you more if the outcomes are better. But I don't care what's in there. Okay, that's a square peg in a round hole. Okay, and they're trying to go in that direction. It's hard to shift a battleship that is making huge amounts of money and is resisting doing that in this sector. But even though we know it's right, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but it's absolutely a system problem, not a person problem.
Right.
It's a design. Yeah, here and there. Okay.
There's two authors that I find absolutely amazing. Any of the ones by Yoshio Kushi, American Biopic Continuum, which does everything that you're talking about, mind, body, spirit, all of that. And then Carolyn Miss, who has several incredible books about the whole linkage of how, you know, if you don't abdicate the throne of your own health and of your own consciousness, basically the medicine that we're talking about is not even necessary. Because from the time you're a young child, you're taught by your people how you're going to maintain your health mentally, spiritually, metaphysically, and it's a tradition. What's happened in our culture is that we abdicated our own throne. And when the science community basically comes in and tells the spiritual community, you really don't have a foundation to work on, well, we can really look at what science has done to this world. When we talk about the opioid problem in our culture, when we talk about breast cancer in our culture, I remember in the 60s, it was force-fed down every woman's throat. You have to take a pill. You're in control of your body. You have to take a pill. And it clearly said then that this causes reproductive cancers. And now we've had the powers that be massaging into this wonderful, caring races with pink ribbons, when in fact it was unleashed for profit motive that every girl who was 18 had to be on a pill. So it is undeniably a conviction against what science purports itself to represent and what it's done. Europe doesn't even want our food anymore with the genetically modified food, and we weren't even asked in a democracy, we would give the scientists permission to put this, to mess with our food.
I think you're right. We have to take back. You have to be your own agency. And actually, in fact, the studies show that if you're engaged in your own self-care, it almost doesn't matter what you're doing. There's some, but if you're engaged in your own self-care, you have better outcomes. Okay? You're more likely to get better for that. And we have been told, well, they're the experts, just do what they want. Any of you watch the evening news? What comes every advertisement, right? It's a drug advertisement, right? If you watch the evening news. That being said, we have to be careful. Those of you that are very spiritually oriented, okay, like Carolyn Miss and others, we have to be careful that we don't lose the fact that the whole person is also the body. And that it isn't just one way. It isn't like just the body, just like we say, and many of us don't believe that that the brain explains all of the mind and all the spirit. I don't think we can say the spirit also, I know in this crowd it might be controversial. We can't say that the spirit also explains the entire body. They are epiphenomena, okay? They're actually part of the whole person. And if we pay attention to only the spiritual component, I can tell you many people that I've had who've done that could have had their life saved. Could have had their life saved because they said, oh, it's not in my body, it's a spiritual thing, I'm just going to go work on that. And they didn't go and get themselves cured, okay, when they could have got themselves cured. So you really do have to take a whole picture and do an integrative component where you're integrating this in a rational way. He had his hand up back there, if you don't mind. So.
Thank you. Based upon my limited knowledge, the process, the transcendent process, the human process between healer and something reminds me, based on my limited knowledge, of the process of exorcism. Had you in any of these group discussions of this topic ever been raised?
Yeah, so the exorcism model was similar to one of the last of the four models I showed you that these healing systems used to explain what they were doing. And that was the one where the spirit is there and I'm going to go pull it out, okay, or manipulate it. Shamans do that all the time in many indigenous cultures where, they literally go on a trance journey, sometimes collectively, and they go find the spirit or they go find the soul, they bring it back and put it in. So that's one approach. That's one way of thinking about this area.
I want to now say a lack of a word. Anyway, what I think is very important what you said to not to have an integrated view. And I think for every individual, most likely there are certain times in your life where you are more or less on this or on the other side for whatever reasons. You cannot pick this whole thing now out, and it's nice to discuss it like this, but at the end of the day, you are a doctor practicing in the United States, which on many levels is, I would say, far more stressful than you would be a doctor in Europe or even in Europe, in Denmark, because of all the pressure which also you are a person too, and you have different days where you feel yourself more spiritually connected, and other days where you are probably very happy that you have these other tools, the good old practical physician approach. Yeah, that's what
Yeah, no, there's no question about it. There are systems that allow this to happen much better. And it's interesting that you mentioned Denmark, because Denmark is a great example compared to what we have here. We just did a survey in this country of physicians about self-care and what they need and asking patients to take care of a person and all that stuff. And the number one, they all believe it was important, believe it or not. Physicians actually believe it was important. The number one challenge they said in this country was time. They didn't have time to actually sit with the patient and ask these questions that I mentioned in those areas. And you can see how that gets manifest on a macro level by the amount of time people invest in primary care. Because primary care is where all these different things come together around your life, and chronic diseases we have to go for a long period of time and not just going into the surgery or whatever in those areas. We invest 5 to 6% of our healthcare budget in this country in primary care. About 30 years ago, Denmark decided that they were going to bump that up. They were about the same at the time. They were going to bump it up to 20%. Huge, more than almost triple. Okay, over triple. And they did that over 20 years. And what they had to do after about 20 years? Over that 20 years? They had to close half the hospitals. They did. They didn't need them. Okay? They didn't need them. Now, that's okay if you're paying for it all, right? We're saving all this money on expensive stuff because now we've got it distributed and we're preventing it. We're taking care of the whole person. We're engaging in self-care, all the things we talked about in those areas. If you try to do that in this country, hospitals will say, they will come out with the biggest lobbying thing, to stop that or undermine it as possible. So we're in this challenge. Okay, we're in this challenge.
Yeah, you come as a doctor, you come out of university with a big loan that you have to pay back, or many of them. The next thing is the insurance you need. Especially you mentioned in Denmark. In Denmark, doctors don't have to fear that they get sued if they do not make the whole array of possibilities and testing. Because
a third of which we do in this country you don't even need. They have actually shown we're wasting a third of our medical interventions for things you don't even need. Third, that's a billion right there. Yeah, you're right. No, so these are all interacting parts of the system that the people, the human beings who know what it's like to be with another person and allow healing to emerge and make the challenging decisions that are necessary, where the facts come in and our intuition comes in and we put them together and we say, what's best for you? Okay, there's not space to do that. There's not time to do that. There's not training to do that. The money isn't going into that, and that's the challenge.
I have 3 questions. First, you mentioned as you began your presentation the importance of compassionate connection and that interrelationship, that bond that creates that entanglement of energy in regard to healing. And then you also mentioned the need to have faith in a way, the religious component or the spiritual component in regard to your perspective of what you predict in 5 years and that faith in whether or not you may be healed by a physician or in the process of taking a particular medication that you may prescribe. And then you mentioned on top of that how a sense of consciousness can influence the healing process and being at peace, which you can get through meditation. How can this be applied in trauma-based approaches for children, and so that they can reduce their at-risk potential for multiple, whether it's mental health, substance abuse, chronic diseases, and societal difficulties they may have because they have to go through.
So, Lisa, I'm sure I understand your question about the trauma-based component for children. Are you talking about acute trauma? No, you're not talking about how do they get to the emergency room if they get hit by a car. You're talking about if they have a ACE experience or they have adverse experiences as childhood, they're abused or neglected, etc. During childhood. So that's actually an entire field of study that has now come to the attention of the healthcare professionals. especially those that work in public health, where there's a lot of that, okay? And what they've shown, just to talk a little bit about it, is that if you have experienced adverse childhood events, that's what it stands for. ACE is adverse childhood events. And there's an array of those, and you can measure those. You can ask people about them, and you can actually score the level of ACEs that you have on those areas. But that correlates with chronic health problems, mental health problems, physical health problems for the rest of your life. Okay, including pain, abuse, cardiovascular disease, asthma, etc. Depending upon when those occurred and how long they occurred, those are formative years. Your brain is forming during that time. Your emotions are forming during that time, etc. Those tend to get fixed, and then you get these habitual responses that you bring into adulthood. And so this is what makes them so difficult to change when you get into adulthood, because they're literally in your brain. Okay, I mean, they're in the mind, they're in your belief structure, they're in all those types of things. Number one is that you ask about them. Okay, so you have to ask about them, and then you have to have something to do about it to help facilitate that process. There's a Center for the Treatment of Adverse Childhood Experiences in adults and children and families in Chicago. It's wonderful. It's run by a friend of mine, Audrey Stillman, and she has created a whole process for looking at that, down from the neurology all the way up to the intervention component in Chicago, which those areas. I'll give you one example of how this can be. That you can do this if you simply do the hope note. Okay, question. So, or you do the PHI. So here's, I had a soldier the other day. I have a veteran who came in to see me, and I teach in a residency, so and I do an integrative pain program. He came in to get his chronic pain in his back and other places. But he also had a bunch of other stuff, PTSD and insomnia and all that kind of stuff. He'd been struggling with for years. Okay. So the resident saw him, and then came in and presented the case to me, and they said, well, what do you want to do? And they said, well, I think we ought to switch this medication to that medication. I said, okay, sounds reasonable. And he gave me his reasons and all that kind of stuff. So then we went and we sat down with the guy. And I had given him this form, the Personalized Health Inventory, which has a little thing on the bottom that says, what do you think? Okay, what's important to you in your life? So I looked at the form, and he had written down my cat and my wife. That's the order he wrote it in. And my first question, well, I didn't ask him, was that the order? Okay, but I said, could you explain this? Okay, why are these so important? He says, he was social phobic, okay? He could not get, he wouldn't go to group therapy, he wouldn't, he had a lot of anxiety after he came back from Iraq and trauma, PTSD, and that kind of stuff. And he said, the cat is my companion during the day, and my wife helps me when she comes home from work. Okay? He was lonely. He was completely lonely, but he also had social phobia and anxiety. He couldn't actually get out and solve that loneliness. So my next question to you, which I asked, this is a social support problem. Okay, it's this dimension. When you do the hope note, okay, it's the social and emotional. How's your social support? Second question, how was your childhood? That's my next question to him. And he turned to the resident and he said, would you leave? Okay. The resident walks out of the room. He looks at me. He said, it was terrible. Between the years of 7 and 14, I was abused almost every day, every week, because I lived in this cult-like family that, literally abused everybody. It was terrible. And I escaped to live with my uncle when I was 14. And as soon as I turned 17, I joined the military. Okay, those areas. This guy had a childhood trauma that set him up for PTSD from his deployment. Okay? Triggered all that kind of stuff that he was now stuck in. It wouldn't even allow him to do that. So we talked about that. We talked about the biology of what happens in his brain when that happened, and then how that was reinforced from the war, And now his brain was structured this way. What could we do? I was simply looking for something that he could do, right? Because he's got to be in the driver's seat. It has to be person-centered. It can't be me saying, change to this drug or that drug. Okay, fine, do that. But that's not going to solve his problem. He won't go to counseling. He won't go to groups, etc. I said, all right, well, would you be willing to write about some of your experiences? Well, I don't know about this. I said, don't write it for me. I don't want to read it. In fact, you can write it and then burn it, okay, or tear it up. Okay, it's just doing the process. Do a little bit of journaling about it, and then next time you come in, we'll just, I'll simply ask you if you did it. You didn't have to tell me. He said, I did it. So he started to do that. He never showed me any of what he wrote, okay? But when we would come back in and get his regular visits or whatever we needed, and then we say, how's the writing going? He says, oh, it's going really well. I started to do this, and he started to feel better. And it's been shown in randomized controlled trials, gold standard, therapeutic writing improves physical and mental outcomes, and even if you don't show it to them. Okay? So he started that. And then the goal is to move him now where he can actually get a deeper type of help. So he was way down the non-readiness stuff, but it started by simply asking him, how was your childhood? And then providing him with some tools that allow him to deal. I don't know if that answered your question.
Sort of. The second, absolutely, it did answer that question, but I have a follow-up to that. If someone learns how to tune in a global way, mind, body, energy, they can perform at a much higher level. And that is something that research has proven as well. And that learning how to, part of it is relaxing and being receptive to learning. Can this research that you're doing be applied to that to reach a higher level of consciousness in a way that creates a very strong global or independent well-being, but then enhancing societal or global well-being in a culture?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's all about consciousness. He was becoming more conscious by writing, right? You can also train someone to breathe, to go inside, to meditate, various forms of this, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Okay? Yes, it reduces stress, but the main, most important thing is it makes you more aware. What goes on, it expands your consciousness in those areas. Those are very powerful. There's lots of good research to show that that has impact. It's generally salutogenic. We even know the biology of it. It induces a parasympathetic response, which induces better digestion, better sleep, better elimination and reparative components. If you're running in a society in which the sympathetic nervous system is, the go, 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 fight, flight, freeze thing is going all the time, you're suppressing your parasympathetic, the relaxation response. And so, what is that kind of mindfulness or meditation type of it? It's exercising the parasympathetic response. It's making it stronger. It's just like a muscle. Okay? And you can measure it in the brain. You can do MRI studies. 8 weeks of 20 minutes of exercising the relaxation response every day will grow the left frontal lobe, which is the part that actually makes it easier to manage those stresses and the amygdala and things that reduce the panic and then put you back into the sympathetic response. So that's a fundamental behavioral thing that I explore with all my patients, no matter what they have, to see is there a way that we can get them to engage in that kind of process. And in some cases, and there's lots of ways, just like there's lots of different ways to exercise. Everybody doesn't need to be a runner or a swimmer or a biker or whatever. There's lots of ways to engage that. Meditation is one of them. Heart rate biofeedback is another one. Going out in nature is another one. Okay? Before I came here, I walked along a little poetry path we have over there. God, look, that was incredible. Okay? Reading poetry, sitting on the bench, looking at the trees, or forest bathing. That's an old Japanese technique. So there's multiple ways to engage in that. You have to know it's real, and you have to pay attention to it. It has to be part of both the behavior and ought to be a standard part of the healthcare nervous system, because it gets almost any benefits.
by the fact that you listed as the two most common or most popular components of healing being love and intention, which is, of course, what we found in our research in human machine. Of course, we didn't call it love, we called it resonance. It was a little more acceptable. But I'm also struck by the fact that when you talk about future, the image of where we'd be in the future, there is an intention certainly involved in that. But one thing that is frequently missing is the love aspect, which involves love for oneself. Many of us find it easy to love other people, but we have a lot of trouble loving and accepting ourselves. And I think that can also get in the way of our health and our well-being, both emotionally, physically, and spiritually.
Yes, no question about it. What I found interesting is that the spiritual leaders, when you explored with them, well, what do you mean by love? They said it's divine love. Okay? And I said, well, what is divine love? Divine love is a sense of connectedness. Okay? Not just with others, but also with the deepest, most important part of you. Okay? So it was caring for you too. Okay? And divine love was something that loved to be cared for all. And I've seen many patients who have interpreted that as, well, if I'm doing something for somebody else, Mother's Day, just taking care of my kids, and then I don't have to, if they neglect themselves, and if they're not tapping into divine love, right? They're tapping into motherly love, but it's not actually the type of love they were talking about. It wasn't the agape. And they will kill themselves that way. They will not only jump on a bus for them, they'll kill themselves over a long period of time. Without actually being aware that that love that they feel for their children, for their family, is the same love that they feel for themselves, because they're the same thing. They're actually the same thing. And you can't divide it and say, okay, I'll do it over there, but I can do it over here. It's not I don't know.
I'm aligning with what you said when I said, in this society, I think we are always engaged, or the whole population, to misunderstand love for yourself with egoism and entitlement. Because it is not, in the younger generation who struggle so much, they think it is love for themselves when they now think they are entitled to everything. I'm just saying that the verbal misunderstanding in society takes its own road.
Yes, that's right. So they use the term self-love, and then they don't know that it's divine love. So.
That's how one opens himself to the divine love.
Taking care of loving yourself.
It's not easy.
It isn't easy, no, it isn't easy. It's so easy to see the outside of the surface, isn't it? It's harder to actually feel, penetrate, partners.
I really think your model is fantastic for healing individuals. We have serious problems in our world, in the culture. We have major dysfunction, serious, unhealthy things happening in our society. Maybe not just this country, but very clearly this country. And I wonder if there's some extrapolation you can make, models for healing individuals, for healing communities and countries.
Yeah. I'm not sure why social evolution occurs the way it does, other than, to put out the arc of society does bend toward justice. but it's a long arc, or it's like global warming. It's that's not a good one, but it's an undulating thing. Certainly politics is that way, and society and wars are that way. I mean, we go through terrible times where it's like, how could this get any worse? Then things, look up, and then you go back, and there does seem to be this sort of cycle that goes on. We have an answer over here, so just let me finish in a minute. And so I think we're certainly in a rapid fluctuation time. I think information has accelerated that process. Information, technology has accelerated that process. But I am hopeful because if you do look at it in the long arc, the progressive nature of understanding benevolence, the benevolent part of the divine, has moved in a positive direction overall. I'll give you one statistic, which is the per capita homicide rate that has occurred over the last several centuries has consistently gone down, okay? Even in the midst of terrible things like wars, okay, that we have. And so the amount of violence overall in the culture and in society, and the aggressiveness of that violence, and the heartlessness of that violence has diminished overall globally. That doesn't mean it's gone. And that doesn't mean there aren't fluctuations in those areas. And when I look at my grandson, I have a 3-year-old grandson, and I talk to my kids, sort of millennials, in those areas, and I see the hope that they're injecting into the world, I realize that there is this force for good. The Dalai Lama, I think, said it when they said the reason that we see all the negative stuff is because most of the time we're there loving the world, right? And then the negative stuff draws us over here because most of the time we're not there, okay? So he kind of turns all that on its head and says, actually, we're living in love most of the time, and sometimes get distracted.
He also said, you said there was some difficulty that people have with the word love.
Yeah.
And you substitute compassion, almost the same place. And that, the other one says, is a 3 important thing. Compassion.
Yeah, and compassion. Right, exactly. And is that the top of the hierarchy, the hierarchy of Maslow's hierarchy? Giving back to society and compassion.
I was just going to bring up this Ibn Khaldun was an Arab historian, and he said that you can never disavow the cyclical nature of the rise and fall of dynasties. So in terms of what we're seeing in this country right now, it's a very young country. And yes, people are still coming in droves to escape because we do represent hope. But in terms of what the citizenry is receiving from movies and television and music, the decadence and the perversion is off the charts. I mean, I remember in the 70s, people saying, well, if you didn't have a computer for your child, they would fall behind. And I just got done doing 18 years of teaching in Princeton. We have droves of children coming in who cannot maintain eye contact. They cannot have discussions with people. They have been in their rooms for 5 to 6 hours every day since they're 3 years old with killing games that is disrupting their neurology. We wondered when we have school shootings. We wondered. No one has even gone after all of these programming companies that make these games. Who would have ever thought, oh, here's your Hanukkah gift, here's your Christmas gift. Kill people in your room for 10 years. It is absolutely off-the-wall stuff. And then if the children don't get that game, there's a new one now called Fortnite. They're not in with the in crowd. And the parents have to buy them, and the fathers play the death games. So, I believe that there are more people that love the world that don't. They're just not covered on the news. That is the only reason why it's so beautiful. world is a beautiful place, but the people who are running all of the deprivation, the perverse profits are making, they're making fortunes.
The technology is the technology. I mean, you know, when books were first invented, you know, we stopped memorizing, right? You know, we stopped putting it all in our head and transmitting it through stories and that kind of stuff. And the technology is that. There's also great application of technology, some great games, nurturing and all that kind of stuff. And then the utilization of these things, you know, technology is neutral. And then, you know, it gets manifested in different ways. Absolutely. So it comes back to using them in a loving, divine fashion.
Yes.
But what is it? What is it that we, that technology and those creators of those of those video games, mainly create games which are killing games, which are negative? I mean, what the heck? I mean, is that they have studied science, they have studied computer science or whatever they study. So what is it that they don't make love games?
They do. Oh, there are. There's some fantastic ones.
Why are those games not born? I mean,
They are. Doing it, maybe not as much in those areas. You know, I think, you know, in gladiator times, they used to take our kids to see the gladiator slaughters, right? And the lion theater, you know, live. And then during the lynching years, you know, everybody would gather to watch the, you know, the lynching. So this is probably better than that, although it's because it's got a different, you know, it's not actually lynching people, but it has, you know, it has a different kind of effect, right, in those areas. You know, I think we do have to, you know, ultimately go back to, you know, what it is that we value. And that's where we need to put our consciousness. I think I'm going to stop there since it is 3 o'clock, and I'm happy to talk to you for a little bit.
We've got a few copies of Wayne's book here. They're on the back table. We are offering it at a discount. It usually sells for $25. They're available for $20. And if you're real nice, you could probably get them to sign it. So we encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity. Thank you very much. That was really a great talk. And please, we're not pushing you out. Feel free to stay and chat. Get yourself another snack and get to know everybody else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.